Hello everybody, and welcome to my beginner-friendly build guide for the Juggernaut. Now, this is intended as a league start build, which means you play this right at the start of the league. You're not going to have a lot of currency or gear to work with. Now, before I get started with the info for you newer players, let me address the more experienced ones. And then you guys that are just here to get the PoB, look at the skills, look at the passive tree, etc., and then go on your way. So the first thing you'll notice is that it's 102k DPS, which is not very high, but this is not taking into account that the skills have yet to be updated for PoB. So Cleave is going to get a ton of flat damage on it, which is going to boost its damage dramatically. Plus, I'm using beginner-friendly items, so stuff that beginners will realistically be able to acquire. And every slot I have an upgraded weapon, so if I just go through real quick and put all the upgrades in, boom, you can see that we just jumped up to 185k DPS. Plus, this is a 5-link damage, so if we just put in a 6-link damage, now you're at 262k damage. Okay, that's a little better, right? On top of all of that, this is Shaper damage with no buffs whatsoever, except for my aura, my herald, and bleeding. That's it. And I'm using hemophilia gloves, which gives a chance to bleed on hit, so the chance of Shaper being bled is very, very, very high. So all things considered, there's no flasks, no buffs, no shock, none of that crap. It's just straight Shaper damage. You will always be doing this damage if you're hitting him, period. So there you go for you experienced players. If that's still not enough to tickle your fancy, then I'm sorry, and I hope we'll do better for the next one. All right, now that's out of the way, welcome to the rest of you that are watching the video. Now, as a beginner, the first thing to know is the software that I'm using is called Path of Building. So all you have to do is type in Path of Building on Google. Now, this is just a site where OpenRL, who's the developer of Path of Building, just puts all the stuff. So you'll just go to the top one here, go down here, you can download either the zip file and then unzip it if you're familiar with that stuff, or you can just download the exe and let it do all the setup for you. So as soon as you're done with that, you want to go over here to import, export, build, and the link to the PoB is in the description. All you have to do is copy that link and click this button, import from pastebin. You just paste the link here, click import, and then boom, it should pull it up right here. Everything as you're looking at right now on the video. So as the title states, this is a Juggernaut build, which means you have to pick the Marauder as your class, and then once you get to your Ascendancy class, you pick the Juggernaut. Now we'll get to what that means in a second. So I'll do a quick zoom out of the passive tree so you see generally what it's going to look like. You can see you start here, and you'll go all the way up here, and then the farthest you go right is all the way over here. So I recommend picking up life nodes as soon as possible because they're very, very important to the overall survivability of your character. Now, you technically can go wherever you want on the tree. So I would do something like this as I'm leveling up. I would start, I would take all these nodes, I would keep following this way. This is the only way you can go. And then once I get to here, I'd probably go up here, grab these life nodes first, then get this wheel right here. This is your crit cluster right here. I'll zoom in a little more. This is crit, all this crit right here. So you go like this. Whee, go this way, go through here, go up here, boom, and then go up here, grab these 3 life nodes, ignore this endurance charge for now, come down here and get this crit, and then once you have basically this top section here, minus the endurance charges and that jewel, then you're going to go over here and you're going to go all the way to the duelist section and pick up this node right here, Dervish. Once you get to Dervish, you should be around Act 3, maybe Act 4. So by then you want to start prioritizing your endurance charges, which are these nodes right here, stamina, endurance, and vigor. You want to prioritize getting those as well as a little more damage, and specifically this jewel socket right here, because the jewel that we're using is a reward from Act 5. Basically, as soon as you start Act 5, you will get this as one of your options to take from a quest reward. You want to take Overwhelming Odds, which is a specific jewel that buffs Cleave. Now, the jewels and skills for the Legion patch have not yet been updated inside this software, but as soon as they are updated, they will be reflected in this software automatically. You don't have to change anything. So it doesn't change the fact that you just need Overwhelming Odds as your quest reward from Act 5. And it's very obvious when you get to that point, trust me. So the point with that is you want to socket that jewel right here in this socket as soon as possible. So I would recommend after you get through all that, you go up here, get that life, you go down here to the duelist, get Dervish, then I would go back, just boom, spend your next 2 points, get that jewel socket, and wait until you get Overwhelming Odds. As soon as you get it, put it in there because it buffs your Cleave significantly. And then after that, you continue the same thing. You get life and you get damage. And then after that, you pretty much have free reign on the passive tree. Get life if you're dying too much and you want to be a little tankier, and get damage if you're not dealing enough damage or you just want to kill stuff a lot faster. So I should note that this build revolves around dual wielding swords because Cleave attacks with both of your weapons at the same time. So dual wielding weapons provides a very big benefit. So you see here, I'm taking nodes that have to do with critical strike chance, critical strike multiplier. Down here, things to do with swords. So critical strike with swords, physical damage with swords. Over here, we have more of the same stuff. This is a dual wielding node. Here's a little bit of leech. You absolutely will need all of this leech, but to start out, once you start going this way on the passive tree, which is the right side, I would just pick up this node right here, which is the life and mana leech, because you do need the mana leech, but you don't really need the life leech because you're Juggernaut and you're going to be regenerating a ton of your HP constantly. Don't waste 2 passive points getting those 2 nodes until you get later into the game. And I briefly want to talk about this cluster right here. So as I zoom out here, this is the far right hand of the tree, okay? These nodes are so powerful for your build. These are insanely good. These nodes right here, all of these nodes, you want to get these. If you are in desperate need of damage, you want to make your way all the way over here to the right side of the tree and grab these nodes because they are very, very, very good. Plus, they're right next to some insane life nodes as well. So other than that, that's it. This is the passive tree. Again, you start here, so you just want to follow, go up here to the top. top first, then go back to here, make your way towards the duelist area. This is the duelist area right here. And you want to grab Dervish. Then you go back over here, get the jewel socket and wait until you get overwhelming odds. And then from that point on, it's just filling in endurance charge nodes, life nodes, and damage nodes in no real particular order. All right, now let's go over the Ascendancy class, which is Juggernaut. Now, the main idea of the Juggernaut is he's very tanky and he does a lot of damage. In fact, he's so tanky that he's jokingly referred to as the thick boy. So if you have not seen the beginner's guide series that I put out, I highly recommend you go back and watch all of it before you watch this video, because the details in those videos will help you understand what I'm about to go over. Now, your Ascendancy class is basically a class on top of your class, and it purely provides you with positive benefits. These are all positive effects for your character. You have a maximum of 8 points to spend, but realistically, as a newer player, you're probably only going to have 6. So the 6 points I recommend you spend. Number 1, when you first pick your Ascendancy class, you'll get 2 points. And I recommend you do these 2 points here, the armor and attack speed, and then undeniable. Undeniable should be the first node that you grab. Then once you get your next 2 points, I recommend going over here to unflinching. When you get your next 2, I recommend getting unbreakable. And then finally, for your last 2 points, if you manage to get there as a newer player, that's freaking awesome. You did an amazing job. Then you take unstoppable as your last node. Now, the main idea here is the undeniable node gives you a bunch of accuracy and a bunch of synergy with damage and crit strike in relation to your accuracy. So in other words, the more accuracy you have, the more damage you're going to be doing. And then over here, the kind of theme of the Juggernaut is endurance charges. So this node just gives you a bunch of chances to gain endurance charges, which is why in the passive tree here, you want to go for the nodes that give you +1 to maximum endurance charges, because the more endurance charges you have, the less damage you're going to take. This node is just a purely defensive node, gives you some life regen, reduced damage taken, armor received from body armor is doubled. So the more armor you have on your chest, the more armor you're going to receive from this, which is amazing. And then you just get even more life regen with that bottom mod. So it's basically just a very strong defensive node. And then finally here, unstoppable. The main point of this node is cannot be stunned and movement speed cannot be modified to below base value. Now, all this means is that you can't be stunned, number 1, but more importantly, you can't really be slowed either. Now, yes, if you're inflicted with a slow debuff, you're going to move slower, but this node prevents you from walking like insanely slow, which later in the game slows become very powerful. So this is an overall very good node, but it's not as impactful as the other 3, which is why I recommend taking this last. All right, now that we've gone over the passive tree, let's take a look at the skills that we're going to be using. So over here on the top left, once you import the build, you'll be on the tree tab, which is passive skill tree. You just want to go over here to skills, click on skills. Now, all of these are labeled based on what they do. So we'll start with the Cleave, which is the 5 link. Now, the maximum number of links is 6 for a skill, but realistically for your newer players, you're really only going to have 5 links to work with. Now, all that to say, a 6th link is ideal, but realistically not going to be achievable for a newer player. So your main skill is Cleave, and it's going to be linked to melee physical damage, increased critical strike support, multi-strike support, and concentrated effect support. Now, this is a physical damage based build that relies on critical strikes to boost the damage a little further. So the melee fizz just boosts the overall fizz damage, and then the crits scale that even more. So to boost Cleave's damage outside of the gems that are linked to it, we have mana reservation skills. This is your aura as well as your herald. So these are skills that reserve a portion of your mana and give you a permanent buff. Herald of Ash gives you additional fire damage based off of your physical damage, and Hatred here basically does the same thing, but it's for cold damage and it's a little more effective, so it reserves a little more of your mana in return. And it's important to note that Hatred and Herald of Ash do not need to be linked to anything. In fact, if you do link them to stuff, it's going to increase the amount of mana that they reserve, and that's not worth it. So you want them unlinked to any supports. That's very important. So moving on here to your movement skill, it's going to be Whirling Blades with Blood Magic and faster attacks. So Blood Magic makes you spend life instead of mana, and trust me, you have tons of life and tons of regen, so it's not going to matter. And then faster attacks just makes you attack faster with the movement skill, so in other words, you move faster. Now, the central theme to the Juggernaut Ascendancy are your endurance charges. So it'd be useful to have a method of generating endurance charges, right? So the method here is Enduring Cry, which is a war cry. Essentially, you just tap the key once, you'll let out a quick cry, and then boom, it gives you endurance charges based on how many enemies are around you. It also provides you with a little bit of life regen. So if you have a spare link, I like to put increased duration in there, because the longer the duration of the skill, the more time the life regen is affecting you. But this link is absolutely not necessary. So if you just have room for the Enduring Cry, put it in there, no problem. It doesn't really matter. So let's go over a couple ways to temporarily boost your damage. So the first one I'm going to go over is Ancestral War Chief. It's a totem that you place and it lasts for about 10 seconds or so. So you really only need to use this thing when you're in a boss fight. Now, the totem itself does some damage, but the primary reason for using it is that while you're in its radius, it gives you a buff that gives you more melee damage. So this basically works like a mini skill link, but it's a temporary buff. It can be killed by monsters, so it's not going to stay alive all the time, but it's really useful in boss fights. Like I said, you just plop it down, let it start smacking the boss, and it gives you a little bit of damage in return as well. And then finally, the last source of temporary damage is a curse called Vulnerability vulnerability. Now, there's a few ways you can use your curses, but for this one, I'm going to use the gem called Cast When Damage Taken, which, as the name implies, it will cast whatever is linked to it when you take a certain amount of damage. Now, the very important note here is to keep Cast When Damage Taken at level 1. Essentially, you want this thing to be casting all the time. So if you keep it at level 1, a very small amount of damage is required for you to cast the skill. And the skill you want to link to it is a curse called Vulnerability, which simply increases the amount of physical damage a target takes, as well as gives you a chance to bleed them, as well as gives you a chance to inflict bleeding on them, which is a synergy with an item that we'll cover in the items section. Now, if all of that was a little too much info, don't worry. At the end of the video, I'll showcase some gameplay of this build in action, and you can see how relatively simple all this stuff works. Again, the main point to drive home is that Cleave is your primary skill, and your aura is Hatred, your Herald is Herald of Ash. The rest of it is just supplementary to your Cleave. All right, and let's move on to the items section now. So again, go to the top left, click on items, and here you go, you're in the items tab. So before I explain what each item does for the build, I want to make the important note that the stats on the items that I put here in Path of Building are arbitrary. As in, aside from general things like the amount of damage on a weapon, the specific stats themselves are up to you and what you find best for your build. For example, every piece of gear I put in here does not have elemental resist on it at all. And that's because there's so much variance in how you cap your resistances, as in I might have pretty much all my resistances on 1 or 2 items, but more than likely as a newer player, your resists are going to be spread out around all of your items. Therefore, it's really hard for me to dictate which item your resists are going to be on. But please don't misconstrue this point. You absolutely need to cap your resists. Now, if you don't know what I mean by this, you need to go back and watch part 3 of my beginner's guide where I explain defense in its entirety. But again, just know that the stats on these items are arbitrary except for the ones that I actually have put on the items. So starting with your weapons, you're going to use swords that rely on critical strike chance and have a pretty good amount of attack speed. So what you're shooting for is about 300 DPS, you want about 6% crit chance, and you want about 1.7 attacks per second. Those are the 3 main stats on your weapon. If it has anything more than that, that's awesome, but it's not necessary. And you want to use 2 swords, obviously. So weapon 2 is just an exact copy of weapon 1. So pretty much for every piece of armor, you just want life and resistances. That's it. Now you can roll other mods that help your damage, for example, like added physical damage or attack speed, but the main points on your armor are life and resistances. That's it. And the exception here are your gloves, which are going to be hemophilia. Now these are pretty cheap, unique gloves, and all they basically do is give you a little extra damage when the target is bleeding. That's it. So it's just an easy way to squeeze out a little more damage. Another important note is that your boots need to have some movement speed on them. So anywhere from 20 to 30% is good. So I put it right in the middle at 25. Your amulet is going to be very important because due to the nature of using a sword as your primary weapon, you're going to need a lot of dexterity to use the swords. So I'd recommend an amulet that has a lot of dexterity on it, because otherwise you're going to have to supplement that dexterity through your passive tree, and your passive points are very, very, very valuable. So I recommend you fix any issues with base stats, as in dexterity or intelligence, through your gear. So again, if this is a little too much info for you guys, go back and watch part 3 where I go over items and their mods and trading to find better items in detail. And then rings, you have the same idea. You want life, resistances, and then any base stat that you need more of, so dexterity or intelligence. And then here with your flasks, the 4 main flasks you need are a diamond flask, a divine flask, a quicksilver flask, and a basalt flask. Those are 4 flasks. They're very easy to find. They're very common. So the diamond flask here makes your critical strike chance lucky. And all that means is if you roll for a critical strike and you don't hit the crit, it'll just re-roll that chance. Essentially, it gives you more chance to crit. Now for your life flask, I suggest an instant recovery flask. So the 2 mods for that are either seething or bubbling. In my opinion, seething is a little better. And then for your quicksilver flask, the mod you want on that is of adrenaline, because the quicksilver flask gives you increased movement speed, and the of adrenaline suffix gives you even more movement speed. So it makes sense to have a movement speed mod on your movement speed flask. And then finally, the basalt flask here gives you a little bit extra physical mitigation, and a lot of damage in this game is going to be physical damage, so this is very helpful. And then finally here, I decided to put in this unique flask called Lion's Roar, because it gives you more melee physical damage while it's in effect. It just gives you a little bit more damage as you use this one, so why not have a damage flask as well? And that's pretty much it for the items here. Now in most slots, I also have an upgrade item that you can work towards as a newer player. So for your swords, you're going to work towards the On's Might unique weapons. And if you've seen the beginner's guide, you'll know what these items do. But basically they revolve around frenzy charges, and they give you additional benefits while you have frenzy charges and while you don't have frenzy charges. I'm not going to explain exactly how they work. Just know that these are what you're working towards, and once you get 2 of them, them because you're dual welding, then you want to use the jewel called pacifism here. And once you have those two swords plus the pacifism, you're just going to get even more damage. So you'll see if I make the changes here, I'm at 102k damage. Let's put in both swords, and then let's go down here to put in pacifism. We go from 102 to 122k damage. Another important upgrade to go over is your helmet. What you're working towards is the Abyssus. Now, this item is absolutely nuts, but the downside of the item is also absolutely nuts. As I mentioned, physical damage is the primary source of damage for monsters. And the effect of the item is that you take increased physical damage, and it's not a little. It's like 40% increased physical damage at best. At worst, it's 50%. So this is a big risk versus reward item, but just know that this is what you're working towards in the helmet slot. And then finally, the last upgrade you're working for here are the bubonic trail boots. They give you a little bit of extra movement speed, and they give you an abyssal socket on your boots, which is very, very good. Just think of abyssal sockets, but when you first load the build, these will be the items that are selected, and this is what I recommend you go for. All right, and that pretty much does it with the beginner build guide for the Cleave Juggernaut League Starter. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below, as well as your feedback. Now, I will be starting this build as my League Start character, so if you're interested in watching me play this live, and especially if you want to ask me questions, you could check out my Twitch at twitch.tv/woollygaming. It's all one word. Once the Legion League goes live on Friday, June 7th, I will be streaming Path of Exile a lot. So again, if you have any questions or just want to come hang out, twitch.tv/woollygaming. Also, we have a Discord server, so if you want to just come hang out, or if you play Risk of Rain 2 as well, you can go on that Discord server. We have LFG, we have a general chat, we have a questions, everything. Link to both of those are in the description and my pinned comment below. Thank you for watching.